My name is Elsbeth Corwin, and I still remember the moment I stopped being a person and became the burden. It was a Tuesday. Not that Tuesdays matter much once you're nearly 80 and live by someone else's calendar. I was standing just outside the den, arms full of folded linens, about to ask if anyone had seen my glasses. I paused when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice. "She's just too much lately," Simone said. Her tone wasn't cruel. That's what made it worse. It was casual. Routine. We have our own lives. This whole setup wasn't meant to last forever. There was a soft agreement. My son Peter. "I know. But what do we do? She has nowhere to go." Then, like a whisper shot through a blade, Simone added, "Maybe that's not our problem." I stood there frozen behind the wall. The linen slipped from my arms and fell to the carpet. I didn't pick them up. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not since I lost my husband. A part of me detached. Quietly. Like something sacred had quietly been scraped out of me. Not rage. Not despair. Something colder. Something cleaner. I didn't storm in. I didn't shout. I just walked back to the guest room, excuse me, the converted laundry room where I'd been temporarily staying for the past 14 months. I closed the door softly, sat down on the twin bed pushed against the water heater, and I listened. Not with ears, but with a lifetime's worth of memory. I remembered the house Peter now lived in. How we'd bought it in 1983. I remembered scraping wallpaper, carrying in box fans during the summer heat, and planting hydrangeas out back. The very back porch Simone sipped her lattes on that was my husband's design. He handlaid every plank. He died before it was finished. And when I sold my house to move in with them, I used that money to help Peter avoid a second mortgage. My name was nowhere on the deed. "Too complicated," he'd said. "We'll make sure you're comfortable, Mom." Comfort. Such a graceful lie. After dinner that evening, no one asked why I was so quiet. They rarely did. I was already fading in their eyes like furniture that came with the house. Present but not seen. That night I started writing. Nothing dramatic. Just a few lines in the back of an old crossword book. Maybe that's not our problem. Noted. September 12, 8:03 p.m. From the other side of the wall, it became a habit. The next morning, when Simone handed me a list of chores to keep me active, I wrote, "Try folding laundry and making beds for the woman you just called unnecessary." September 13, 9:24 a.m. Kitchen island. She smiled while saying it. I didn't write to punish. I wrote to remember, because if no one else was keeping track of who I'd been, I would. 1 week later, they hosted a barbecue. The neighbors came. Laughter, drinks, lawn chairs. I was asked to stay inside in case anyone needed a hand. My hands trembled all night, not from age, but from invisibility. That night in my notebook, "You're better in here, where it's cooler," they said. But it was 74 degrees and cloudy, and I had brought the lemonade. September 19, 10 p.m. I was never introduced to the Hendersons. I found the spiral-bound notebook oddly comforting. No one else knew it existed, so no one could control the narrative. It was the only place left that I didn't need permission to be myself. Then came the moment I won't forget. Not even if I live to 100. Peter was on a work call. I was bringing him coffee, still trying to be helpful. His laptop was open. I didn't mean to look, but the words were right there on the screen. An email. "We may need to look into long-term facilities. It's becoming unmanageable with her here." Unmanageable, like a leaking faucet. Or a dented car. He ended the email with, "Thanks again for the referral. We'll discuss options after the holidays." Referral. Options. The last sip of my existence was being poured into an institution without my knowledge. That night, I sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling for hours. And in my notebook I wrote, "They plan to move me. After Christmas. Without asking. I am the loose end of their holiday plans." October 2nd, 10:42 p.m. There comes a moment in every life where silence stops being a defense and becomes a weapon. That was the night I began writing, not just to remember, but to return. To reclaim something they'd taken. They thought I was a burden. No, I was a ledger, and I was balancing. In the days that followed, I stopped trying to be anything for them. I no longer arranged the breakfast tray with the cinnamon toast Simone liked. I no longer reminded Peter to take his cholesterol pills even though he always forgot. I didn't iron the pillowcases. I didn't hum while folding laundry. I simply existed, moving like fog through the corners of their lives. Invisible, but watching and writing. It wasn't just a journal anymore. It was a record. A growing archive of every passing insult dressed as politeness. Every omission, every accidental oversight. Every time I was excluded from a conversation about my own future. I started keeping timestamps. Not just the date and time, but the temperature of the room. The color of the mug. The expression on Simone's face when she smiled with teeth that never reached her eyes. I was mapping a crime scene. A quiet one. One that left no blood, only bruises you couldn't see. It was around this time that Simone decided to repurpose the old closet, which of course was code for throwing out everything that didn't spark joy in her version of the house. Boxes of my husband's letters, gone. A dress I'd worn to my daughter's wedding, gone. My hand-painted china teacups wrapped in yellowing newspaper from 1975. Too delicate, she said. We need the shelf space. They donated them. I saw the receipt in the trash. What they didn't realize was that every object they discarded had a memory attached. And every memory they erased I wrote down with more clarity, more venom, more steel. Peter held up the photo of his father in uniform and said, "We have too many old things." Ah! Simone laughed and kissed his cheek. October 14, 3. So 5 p.m. Photo never returned to frame. Discarded. There was a cruel irony in watching them erase me from the house I'd built. The same walls I had once scrubbed clean after Peter's chickenpox. The same floorboards where Simone now hosted her book club while I stayed in the laundry room because it's just too much noise for you. I began taking notes on their routines. Not out of paranoia, out of strategy. Peter always came home at 6:15. He went straight for the cabinet and poured himself a glass of Cabernet. One ice cube. Always one. Simone meditated in the mornings, but often used that time to scroll on her phone while incense burned beside her unused yoga mat. They were patterns. Predictable ones. And that predictability meant something crucial. I could plan around them. My decision was made one night when I heard Simone on the phone. She was talking to someone, her mother, I think. She was laughing. "Oh, come on, we're doing our best. It's like living with a ghost that won't stop judging us." I sat in the dark holding that sentence in my hands like a dead bird. Heavy, phenol, cold. But ghosts I thought can haunt. And that was the night I opened the trunk at the foot of my bed. Inside were decades of forgotten things. Not by me, by them. Letters from Peter when he was at university. Mother's Day cards that said, "Thank you for believing in me." Simone's handmade gift from their engagement party. A pressed flower frame with a note that read, "You are the mother I never had." All smiles and sentiment. All lies now. I laid them all out on the bed. Photographs. Notes. Receipts. I paired them with the corresponding quotes they'd said in the past year. On one side of the page, "You're just too old to understand." On the other, a photo of me holding Peter's diploma after his graduation, beaming with pride, the caption reading, "I owe it all to her." It was a museum of contradictions, a gallery of hypocrisy, and I wasn't just its curator, I was going to be its docent. By morning, I'd created the first draft of what I would later call the truth they wrote. Each page would contain their own words, not mine, theirs. The things they said when they thought I wasn't listening, when they believed they had the power to define me in my absence. And then paired with those words, I'd place a memory, an image, a record of who I actually was. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was restoration. If they wanted to treat me like a shadow, I'd become the kind of shadow that reveals shape, depth, consequence. That afternoon, Peter found me in the dining room with all the documents spread out. "What's all this?" he asked. "History," I replied without looking up. "Truth." He laughed awkwardly. "Planning another memoir." I looked at him, then really looked. "No," I said softly. "Just making sure the story gets told by someone who was there." He didn't understand. Not yet. But he would. They say revenge is best served cold, but I've learned that the most exquisite form is not served at all. It's read. After that afternoon in the dining room, I became methodical. I divided the truth they wrote into sections. One for Peter, one for Simone, and yes, even one for my granddaughter Clara. Clara was 15, but had already adopted the family's casual cruelty like a second language. The way she rolled her eyes when I entered a room or muttered boomer brain when I asked a question. I didn't fault her entirely. Children don't invent fire, they inherit it. Still, she had her page. I found a birthday card I gave her when she turned 10-1 with a poem I'd written just for her. I'd spent hours composing it. Her reply: a text. TX. Beside that poem, I printed the screenshot of her group chat I once accidentally saw on her iPad when she forgot to close it. My grandma's obsessed with writing dumb stuff, like she's still teaching. She even writes poems LOL. It was cruel in the way only teenagers can be. Unthinking, sharp. But even unthinking cruelty has weight, especially when it accumulates. Each of their pages began the same way, a quote from their mouths, then a moment from the past, then a photo, then a timestamp. It was a courtroom, and they were on trial, judged not by me, but by their own contradictions. I wasn't seeking guilt. I was offering a mirror. Meanwhile, I went about my days with silence as my armor. When Peter asked if I wanted to join them for a movie night, I smiled and declined. Simone began hosting declutter sessions, asking what things I was ready to let go of. I told her, memories I don't need anymore. She smiled, not catching the hook beneath those words. At night I typed. I borrowed Clara's old printer and carefully formatted the pages, complete with headers and footnotes. I chose soft beige paper, nothing too theatrical. This wasn't a declaration. It was a revelation. One evening, Peter opened my door without knocking. "You okay, Mom?" I turned from my desk and nodded. "Just organizing things." He glanced around. "You've always been thorough." "Someone has to be," I said gently, and I think in that moment something flickered in his eyes. Like he knew a storm was forming but couldn't place the thunder. I waited until the week before Christmas. It was always the time they softened, the time they pretended, the time they wrapped obligations in bows and called it love. Simone insisted on planning the family dinner. Clara was back from school. The tree was up. The house smelled of cinnamon and artificial pine. It was perfect. On the morning of the dinner, I placed 3 manila envelopes under the tree. Each had a name. Each was tied with twine. No labels, no decoration, just truth carefully bound. At 7:00 p.m., as the roast was resting and the wine was being poured, I stood up. "I'd like to say something," I said, my voice steady. Peter looked up from his phone. Simone paused mid-sip. Clara sighed. "I won't be long," I added, walking to the tree and retrieving the envelopes. "These are for you," I said, handing each one their parcel. Clara scoffed. "Is this like homework?" Simone forced a smile. "Elsbeth, what is this?" Peter frowned. "Mom, can't this wait?" I shook my head. "It's everything you've said about me, everything I heard, everything I remembered, and everything you've forgotten I gave you before that." There was silence. Simone's fingers froze on the twine. Peter looked pale. "I've written nothing in these pages," I said, "that didn't come from your own mouths. All I've done is pair them with proof that I once mattered." Still, they didn't move. So I walked back to my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Clara opened hers, first muttering, "Whatever." The room changed as soon as her eyes hit the first page. Her smirk flattened. Then Simone opened hers. The smile cracked almost immediately. Her lips parted, but no words came. Peter was the last. He read slowly. His breathing grew louder, then slower, then louder again. None of them spoke. And for the first time in years I felt heard. Not because I had shouted, not because I had wept, but because I had finally held up the mirror they refused to look into. There were no accusations, just documentation. At the end of each packet I included a simple note. "I was not a burden. I was your beginning. And you tried to write my ending without my consent." Peter looked up. His mouth moved, but the words stalled. "I didn't mean," he began. "But you did," I interrupted gently. "Maybe not with hatred, but with convenience. And convenience is a quieter kind of cruelty." Simone wiped her cheek. Clara left the table. I stood again. My legs shook slightly, but I didn't show it. "I'll be reclaiming my husband's study tomorrow," I said. "And I'd like my name added back to the deed." I've already contacted an attorney. Peter blinked. You're serious? I nodded. Very. Then I picked up my teacup, took a sip, and smiled. It tasted like freedom. The next morning, the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it. No Simone blending her kale smoothies at 7. 15 no Clara thumping down the stairs with her earbuds and no Peter's slippers shuffling toward the coffee machine. Just silence so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood in the center of the living room suitcase by my side and looked around the home I had helped pay for decorate and keep afloat. A painting of the lake we once visited hung crooked above the fireplace. The hydrangeas in the front yard had died weeks ago, but no one noticed. It was not my home anymore, not in spirit. But it was mine again on paper. True to my word, I had called the family attorney 2 weeks prior, quietly invoking a clause in the original deed I had signed over with Peter. I'd only given him partial rights. A quiet legal decision I'd made years ago because something in me, perhaps that old literature professor's instinct, had whispered, "Don't give them the ending yet." Peter hadn't remembered, but the lawyer had. And now I had the papers to remind him. I walked into the study, my husband's old space. It had been turned into a storage room for Simone's event planning supplies. Glitter, boxes of mason jars, paper banners that said "Live, Laugh, Love." I removed them all. By noon, the room was mine again. I found my husband's old typewriter in the attic, still wrapped in an old towel. I placed it on the oak desk where he used to write sermons for the community chapel. I lit a single candle, not for prayer, but for memory. Simone came to the doorway around 1:00 p.m. She didn't step in. She held the envelope from the night before in both hands like it was a bird she didn't know how to release. "I read it all," she said. Her voice was thinner than usual. I didn't respond. She looked around. "You're really taking the room." "I am." She opened her mouth, closed it, then nodded. And then the part I never expected. "I didn't realize I had become that person," she whispered. "The kind that forgets who built the ground they stand on." I looked at her. Really looked. "I don't need apologies," I said. "I need you to live differently." Simone swallowed hard, nodded again, and left. That was enough for me. Peter, however, stayed quiet. Days passed. I heard him pacing outside my door one evening. He never knocked. Instead, he slid a letter under the door. Just a single page. Handwritten. "Mom, I don't know when I stopped seeing you." Maybe it was when I got so focused on protecting what I had, I forgot who gave it to me in the first place. The truth is, I've been afraid. Afraid of your aging because it reminds me of what I'll become. Afraid of your silence because I knew it held more weight than my words. Thank you for forcing me to read myself. I'm sorry. Peter. I sat in my reading chair, the typewriter beside me, and let the paper rest on my lap. I didn't cry. There was nothing left in me to spill. But I did feel something settle. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something close to recognition. Clara avoided me for days. She took her meals in her room, rolled her eyes when I entered the hallway. But one night she knocked abruptly, then peeked in. "Can I see that poem again?" she mumbled. I looked up from my book. "Which one?" "The one you wrote for me." I pulled open the drawer beside me and handed her the original. It was creased, worn at the edges. She held it like it might shatter. "Can I keep it?" I nodded. "It was always yours." She lingered. "Did I really say those things?" "You did." She blinked quickly. "I didn't mean it." "I know." Clara stepped forward. "Can you teach me how to write one?" That night we sat side by side on the floor. I taught her how to count syllables, how to line emotion with rhythm, how to make language hold a shape. She wrote a poem titled "The Room Beside the Heater." It ended with the line, "She never raised her voice so I heard her more clearly." Days turned into weeks. Christmas came and went. No gifts. Just presents. One morning, I woke up and found a new nameplate on the door to the study. Dr. Elsbeth Corwin, Keeper of the Truth. I didn't know who made it, but it was enough. My burden had become ballast. And they, every one of them now, carried the truth that once threatened to bury me. January brought a chill that seemed to settle into the bones of the house, like it too was waiting for something to thaw. I spent my days in the study. Some mornings, Clara would come in with hot cocoa and her latest poem folded neatly into a notebook we now shared. Her writing was raw, full of sharp edges and softness in equal measure. It reminded me of who I used to be before life wore the corners off. Simone returned to work, but she knocked on my door every Friday afternoon just to ask if I needed anything. She never expected a yes, and I rarely gave one. But the knock itself became a kind of ritual, small, consistent, respectful. Peter took longer. He kept his distance as if unsure whether he was allowed near me again. Guilt does that. It builds walls faster than anger. But the moment finally came. I was in the kitchen making tea when he stepped in. No words, just walked over and began helping. He took down 2 mugs, poured the milk, set the spoons. The silence between us felt fragile, like a bridge made of thread. Then finally he spoke. "You always knew how to write a better story." I looked at him. It wasn't fiction. "I know," he said almost to himself. We sat at the kitchen table, 2 people who had once shared everything and now struggled to hold a single conversation. "I've started therapy," he said. "Not because of what you gave us, but because of what I saw in myself after reading it." That surprised me more than anything else. He continued, voice thick. "I was always afraid you'd become helpless, and I think I punished you for the fear I had of myself ending up the same." I nodded slowly. "It's easier to control what we're afraid of than to sit beside it." "I don't want to control anymore," he said. "Then start by listening." He did. That afternoon, he sat on the couch beside me, and for the first time in years, he asked questions about my life before him, before Dad, before the house. And I answered, not as a mother, not as an obligation, but as a person. Later that week, Clara presented her first real poem at school and won 2nd place in a state competition. She stood proudly with her certificate, and the local paper printed a photo of her with the caption, "Inspired by her grandmother's legacy." When I saw it, I felt something shift again. Not in them, but in me. For the first time since that awful moment outside the den, I felt like maybe I had been more than a shadow in their story. One evening, Peter came to my door holding something. A gift. I raised an eyebrow. "I know you don't want things," he said, "but this isn't really a thing. It's a restoration." He opened the box. Inside was a beautifully bound hardback book. On the cover, "The Truth They Wrote, A Family's Reckoning." He had taken my pages, every word, every note, every quote, and turned them into a private family book. Only one copy. Just for us. "I thought we could add to it," he said. "Over time, not just mistakes, but growth too." I ran my hand across the leather cover, breath caught in my throat. "Only if we agree," I said, "to never edit the past. Only add footnotes." He smiled. "Agreed." Clara helped create a new section in the book called Corrections. In it, she wrote an apology to her younger self for not understanding kindness. Simone added a note about the china teacups she had found the set online, tracked down the exact pattern, and ordered a replacement. They now sat in the cabinet again, not because I needed them, but because they had finally understood what they'd lost. The study became a shared room. On Sunday afternoons, we wrote there, Clara on her laptop, Simone on her planner, Peter sketching architectural ideas he'd long forgotten he loved. I watched them, sometimes marveling at how silence had once been my punishment and was now my peace. I still kept my notebook, still wrote things down, but now I recorded different details. January 22. Clara asked how I forgave. I told her, "You don't have to forget what was said. Just remember who you are anyway." February 2nd. Simone brought in daffodils. She said they reminded her of the ones I planted the year Peter was born. February 9th. Peter asked me to teach him how to write a letter by hand. He said email always felt too easy. We were not perfect. Simone still forgot to knock sometimes. Peter still talked over me when excited. Clara still had moods that rolled in like weather. But there was a new rule in the house, printed on a card above the mantel. "Speak as if someone is listening," because someone always is. They once called me a burden. Now they read me like scripture, not because I demanded it, but because I showed them what forgetting costs, and what memory unshakable written witnessed can rebuild. Spring arrived with a quiet gentleness, the kind that wraps itself around your ankles before you notice the cold is gone. The hydrangeas out front bloomed again, deep blue this time, almost violet. Clara and I planted new ones together, and she asked me what their colors meant. I told her blue meant apology and purple meant understanding. She looked up and said, "Then ours are perfect." Inside the house, life moved differently now. It was subtle, not some cinematic transformation, but a rearranging of tones. The way Peter lingered longer at breakfast asking me how I slept. The way Simone said thank you more often softly without fanfare but consistently. And Clara, well, Clara had become my shadow in the best way. She followed me through routines she once ignored. Tea brewing, shelf-dusting, story reading. Not because she had to, but because she'd begun to realize the gravity of the quiet things. One afternoon, she walked into the study carrying her school backpack. "Can I interview you?" she asked. I chuckled. "About what?" "My history class is doing oral reports on our ancestors." And I figured, well, you're the closest thing I have to history. Is that a compliment or a confession? She laughed. Both. We sat for hours, her recorder between us, as I spoke about the small revolutions of my youth, the time I was suspended for refusing to type a boy's homework, the first paycheck I sent back home to my mother, the moment I chose teaching over marrying the first man who proposed, because he said my books took up too much space. Clara listened, really listened. And when I told her about the night I met her grandfather, how he'd said, "The sharpest mind in the room always wins, but the kindest one stays remembered," she paused the recording and whispered, "You were both." That night, I sat at my typewriter and wrote a page I hadn't written before. March 14th. Today, I was not history. I was present. And that presence was held not out of obligation, but out of love. The truth, it seemed, had not only exposed the rot, it had cleared space for roots to grow again. But not all moments were tender. One rainy Thursday, I got a call from Simone while she was out running errands. "I forgot the grocery list," she said, her voice flustered. "Could you send it to me?" I read it to her slowly, and at the end, I heard her exhale. "You always make things easier," she said. It was the first time she had said that aloud. After I hung up, I stood in the doorway and watched Peter napping on the couch. Clara curled beside him with her head on his shoulder. I remembered when I was the one carrying that tiny head, wiping that same brow during feverish nights, whispering lullabies into darkness. There was a strange ache in knowing I'd handed them the tools for love and watched them misplace them, only to now see them slowly picking them back up. And yet not all memories found redemption. I visited the attic one afternoon, wanting to find my old copy of Jane Eyre. I found it tucked beneath boxes of Simone's decor and Clara's childhood toys. The book was worn, the spine loose, but inside, pressed between the pages, was a photo of me holding Peter as a baby. It had been scribbled on, likely by Clara when she was small, but the ink across my face read, "Old Lady." I stared at it for a long time, not in pain, but in recognition, because even now the work was not done. I could not erase the years where I was misunderstood, overlooked, reshaped into someone else's burden. But I could refuse to carry that weight anymore. So I placed the photo into the back of The Truth They Wrote in a new section I titled Artifacts, because even ugly truths deserve a place. Not to be glorified, but to be seen. And that, I realized, was the difference between shame and accountability. One hides, the other stands. Later that month, Clara gave me a handmade bookmark that read, "Every word you've ever said built me." It sat inside my journal now, between the entry that recorded the day I overheard them call me too much and the entry that recorded the first time they called me truth. The house no longer smelled of antiseptic and neglect. It smelled of lemon oil ink and the faint trace of daffodils. My name was back on the deed. My seat at the table was never skipped. And every Sunday without fail, someone asked me to read from the book aloud, not for punishment, for memory, because in remembering we are rebuilt. One quote at a time. Clara surprised me one afternoon with a small red journal and a wide grin. "It's a gratitude book," she explained, placing it gently in my lap. I started one for myself. "Thought you might want to do it too." I raised an eyebrow. "Is this your way of telling me I complain too much?" She laughed, shaking her head. "No, it's my way of saying, I don't want you to stop noticing things. Just maybe write the good ones down too." It was an innocent gesture, but for me it was seismic. For so long I had documented pain, recorded betrayal, turned memory into defense. But now, for the first time in years, I was being asked to witness joy with the same precision. That evening, I opened the little red journal and wrote, April 5. Clara told me my voice sounds like paper turning. I think she meant it as a compliment. And I kept going. April 7. Simone made me tea without asking. She remembered I like it steeped exactly 4 minutes. April 10. Peter asked me about Dad's favorite hymn. Said he wanted to teach Clara the melody. I didn't stop keeping the truth. I just began allowing beauty to sit beside it. And quietly, a new chapter of our family began writing itself. One Saturday morning, as I was trimming herbs in the backyard garden, I overheard a conversation from the patio. This time, it wasn't one I dreaded. Peter was speaking with a neighbor. We almost lost her, he said. Not to illness, to neglect. We just didn't realize how quiet someone could get until they disappear inside a house full of noise. The neighbor mumbled something inaudible, but Peter's next words landed like sunlight breaking through old cloud cover. She's the spine of this family. We just forgot how to read the chapters she lived before we arrived. I sat back on my heels, soil on my gloves, heart beating in a strange, slow rhythm. Once I had been the burden, now I was the spine. It wasn't victory. It was alignment. Later that week, Clara brought me an assignment from her English class. I had to write about the bravest person I know, she said, dropping a folded paper onto my lap. It was titled, The Woman Who Wrote Us Back to Life. She described my silence not as absence, but as a force that filled the room like wind behind a closed door, waiting, watching, and finally speaking with the weight of everything it had carried. I cried when I read it. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because for the first time I could see my story reflected back through the eyes of someone I had once thought lost to indifference. Simone started leaving notes around the house. Not grand declarations, just quiet acknowledgments. One on my teacup. Thank you for never giving up on any of us. One in the study. I found your old lesson plans. You would have been my favorite teacher. One on the bathroom mirror. You are seen. I kept them all in a wooden box I once used for receipts. I called it my proof of life box. We began a tradition on Thursdays. Story hour. Not the kind with fairy tales. The kind with real tales, family ones. We'd sit around the living room, each of us sharing a memory. One rule. It had to be about someone else in the room. Something they did. Something they said. Something we'd forgotten mattered. I told Clara about the time she sang off-key in the school play, but didn't stop smiling. Peter remembered the night his father cried after I defended him to a furious principal. Simone shared a dream she once had of me reading to her children before she ever had Clara. Every Thursday, a little thread rewove itself into the fabric of who we were trying to become. But I didn't let them forget. The truth they wrote remained on the mantle, not as a threat, not as a wound, as a document. A reminder that every voice matters even when it's quiet. Especially when it's quiet. One evening, as the last bit of spring sun dipped behind the window pane, Clara asked me something unexpected. Do you ever miss who we used to be? I paused, considering it. No, I said. But I remember her. I remember me. I remember the woman who folded towels she never dirtied and washed dishes she never used. The woman who heard herself vanish. And now? She asked. I smiled. Now I remember the woman who wrote her name back into the story. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I hope I grow up to be like you. I laughed gently. No, Clara. Grow up to be better. But keep the pen in your hand. She whispered, always. And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of the house that once made me small, I realized something else. I had not only made them carry my truth, I had taught them to carry their own. Mother's Day arrived with a stillness that made me suspicious. For years it had passed in a blur of forgotten cards, rushed brunches, and last-minute bouquets purchased from gas stations. A polite nod to duty, not affection. But this time it was different. I awoke to the smell of scones baking downstairs, my recipe, not some Pinterest imitation. The sound of Clara humming, the soft clink of china, and then a knock on my door. Peter stood there holding a tray, real linen napkin, my favorite mug, and on the plate a scone dusted with cinnamon just the way I liked. Behind him, Clara grinned, holding something in both hands. Happy Mother's Day, she said, passing me a thick wrapped package. I opened it carefully, peeling back the brown craft paper to reveal a new edition of The Truth They Wrote. This one bound in deep green leather, on the cover embossed in gold. The Truth We Carry, Volume 2. Beneath that, in smaller letters, Collected Words, New and Old, by the Corwin family. I opened to the first page. This book began as a mirror. It is now a map. Each chapter was labeled not by names but by virtues. Humility. Simone's letter about the time she dismissed me and what she'd since learned. Awakening, Peter's admission of how fear shaped his cruelty. Wonder Clara's poem about hearing my laugh for the first time in months. I flipped through slowly, heartful but not fragile. This wasn't apology. This was acknowledgement. Simone appeared in the doorway, hands clasped in front of her like a student asking to enter the room. "There's more," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" She laughed. "Not unless you hate daisies." They led me out to the backyard where the old shed once stood. In its place was a small wooden greenhouse, simple, elegant, painted the same soft gray as the cardigan I always wore. Hanging from its door was a wooden sign, Elsbeth's Words and Roots. Inside were planters labeled with quotes from my journals. On one, "Memory is a garden. Tend it carefully." On another, "Truth is not a weapon. It is a seed." They had even included a writing desk, small but sturdy, tucked in one corner beside a shelf of books and empty seed packets. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk. It was my husband's old tool bench, repurposed, sanded smooth. Peter leaned in. "We thought it was time you had a place where your truths could grow into something more." I couldn't speak. Because what do you say when your grief is honored, your voice preserved, and your roots given soil? For years, I had believed that speaking up would cost me everything. Instead, it had built something new. Weeks passed. Summer crept in golden and generous. The greenhouse became my sanctuary. I grew tomatoes, mint, basil. And in between planting and pruning, I wrote letters to women like me, stories for girls like Clara, reminders that dignity isn't granted. It's reclaimed. One day, Clara brought a friend over after school. I overheard her say, "That's my grandma. She's the reason I want to be a writer." Her friend responded, "She looks like someone who remembers everything." Clara grinned. "She does. And she writes it down so no one can forget." That night, I lit a candle in the study. The old ritual. I pulled out a clean page and wrote, May 23. I am no longer the burden. I am the archive. The teacher. The reckoning. The guide. There was a time when I feared dying quietly, surrounded by people who had rewritten my life without my input. Now I live surrounded by people who ask me to read it aloud. Simone started hosting story circles with her friends, using passages from The Truth We Carry as writing prompts. Peter in his spare time began restoring old books. And Clara started a blog called Grandma Said It First. It's just quotes and poems, but every post begins the same way. In the room beside the heater, she wrote the story that changed us all. The house still creaks in winter. The garage still smells of paint. And sometimes Peter still forgets to knock. But I am not a ghost anymore. I am not the background. I am the ink. I am the voice that stayed. I am the woman who refused to disappear. And now, even when I am gone, they will carry me. In every word. In every root. In every truth I made them hold. The end of summer brought guests. Old friends, distant cousins, even former colleagues I hadn't seen in decades. They came one by one, each holding some excuse passing through town meant to call. Sooner heard about your greenhouse, but I knew the truth. Someone had told them about the book. Word had spread quietly but deeply like roots beneath the surface. Elsbeth Corwin, the once silent mother, the forgotten grandmother, had written something that made people stop, rethink, feel, and perhaps most frightening of all, remember. One visitor in particular stayed with me, Marianne Delaney. We taught together at the university nearly 40 years ago. She'd lost her husband too. Had 3 sons who, in her words, learned affection from their father, and he only taught them scarcity. She held my hand tightly on the porch swing. I read the part about the attic. She said, her voice low. The photo. The ink. I nodded. I had one like that. Except mine said, "Why does she even come?" on a wedding seating chart. We didn't cry. Not then. We just rocked in silence as the cicadas sang and the garden swayed like it was nodding along to an ancient song of women who had quietly kept the world upright. Marianne left me with a poem tucked in my coat pocket. It ended with, "They called us invisible, but we were always the lens. We held the focus. They just forgot to look." Later that week, I found Simone in the study holding one of my old journals, the original spiral notebook. Her fingers hovered just above the page. "I used to think silence was passive," she said. "Now I see it's where power rests, when it's deciding what to do next." I sat across from her. "It's also where survival lives." She looked at me, then really looked. "I was afraid of what you'd write. You still might be." She smiled soft and tired. "I'm not anymore." We truly talked for the first time in years. She told me about the pressure to be perfect, how watching me quietly endure made her feel ashamed for struggling. She confessed how threatened she'd felt when I refused to need her in the way she expected. I told her I had spent years editing myself for everyone else's comfort. And now I was done. She nodded. "I want Clara to learn to tell the truth," she whispered. "Even when it makes people uncomfortable." "Especially then," I said. The greenhouse became a kind of church. People began writing letters to it, literal letters. Neighbors, readers of Clara's blog, former students. Notes arrived, addressed simply to Elsbeth Corwin, the Truth Keeper, Elmwood Street back porch. Clara started reading them aloud every Thursday night. We called it the Truth Hour. Some were raw. I called my mother difficult for 20 years. Then I found her journals after she passed. "I can't stop crying." Others were hopeful. "My daughter said I was too emotional." I wrote her a letter instead of arguing. "She called me yesterday. Thank you." A few came from women older than me. I thought my story ended when my family stopped listening. "You reminded me that the pen doesn't dry unless I let it." We collected them in a wooden box and titled it Testimonies. Not for ego, for evidence. Because healing leaves marks too. Peter built me a bookshelf in the greenhouse, one that curved like an arch over my writing desk. It held volumes of The Truth. They wrote each new one bound in a different color, each containing a new year's worth of entries. Volume 3 was titled The Things We Now Say. It included letters Peter wrote to his younger self, poems Clara had published in her school's journal, Simone's essays on learning to parent a child and an elder simultaneously. I added my own reflections. August 19th. They once erased me to protect themselves. Now they preserve me to understand each other. August 23. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's writing a new page and refusing to tear out the old one. On my 80th birthday, they threw me a celebration under the stars. No banners, no speeches. Just a long wooden table in the backyard, lit by warm fairy lights, surrounded by the people who had once called me too much. Clara read aloud from my journals. Simone recited the first poem she'd ever written. Peter gave a toast, simple, honest, to the woman who taught us to listen, and then made sure we did. That night, as I lay in bed, candle flickering beside me, I opened to a new page in the red gratitude journal. I didn't write a sentence. I just drew a single line, a straight, clean line across the middle of the page. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said, heard, held. In early autumn, I received a letter addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in over 2 decades. No return address. The envelope was cream-colored, its edges slightly bent from travel. I opened it slowly, carefully, like opening an old wound with clean fingers. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery. The handwriting was unmistakable, small, deliberate, with just the faintest rightward tilt. It was from my sister. We hadn't spoken since my husband's funeral. Long story, short fuse. Years of unspoken things hardened into silence. Elsbeth, I read your story. Clara's blog led me there. I stayed up all night reading every word she posted. I wept. Not just for you, for us. I see now what I could never admit. I left you alone because I didn't want to face what you reminded me of my own cowardice. I'm sorry. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Love, Marlene. I sat with that letter in my lap for nearly an hour, watching shadows crawl across the floor. It's strange how time moves in families. It doesn't pass linearly. It folds, bends, repeats. And here was a piece of the past curling back toward me like a leaf caught in the breeze. Clara came in and found me still holding the letter. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm in between." "Between what?" "Between memory and mercy." She sat beside me and read the letter. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy. "Are you going to write her back?" I nodded. "Eventually." "Will you tell her about the greenhouse?" I smiled. "I think I'll send her seeds." That night, I returned to my writing desk and added a new entry to the truth we carry. September 3. The past is not a prison. It's a room with a door. Sometimes you're holding the key and don't know it. That same week, I started receiving emails from women in other cities, some who had read the blog, others who had heard of the Truth Book through word of mouth. They wanted to start their own chapters. Truth circles, they called them. Small gatherings where people shared the words they never said. Letters to mothers, letters to daughters, confessions, corrections, reclamations. Clara and I created a guide. Simple. 7 steps. Begin with silence. Read one truth aloud, yours or someone else's. Do not interrupt. Do not defend. Write what you feel. Pass the pen. Return next week. We published it on Clara's blog and called it "How to Carry the Truth Without Dropping Each Other." Peter took it a step further. He offered our greenhouse blueprint to the local community center. He called it the Listening Shed, a space where elders could write plant share. They opened the first one in a neighboring town. A woman named Bernice sent me a photo of her standing in front of it, holding her great-granddaughter's hand. The caption read, "I told her this was where I found my voice." I printed it and placed it in my artifacts section right beside the scribbled photo from the attic. Because healing and harm should live side by side, so we never forget the distance between them. In mid-October, Clara came home with a stack of printed pages. "I think I'm ready," she said. "Ready for what?" "My book." It was titled "The Room Beside the Heater." A granddaughter remembers. She handed me the manuscript. I wanted to tell our story from my eyes. What I didn't see. What I learned to see. I opened to the first page. I used to think my grandmother was just old. Now I know she's ancient in the way trees are full of rings, weather, and patience. This is what I saw when I finally looked up. I closed the manuscript and took her hand. "Do you know what you've done?" I asked. She grinned. "Told the truth." "No," I said. "You made it beautiful." Weeks later, we hosted the first community truth circle in our backyard. 10 people, all ages. One notebook passed around. Simone opened the circle. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "I used to think love was loud," she said. "Now I know it's also the quiet thing you do when no one claps." Everyone wrote. Everyone listened. And when the circle ended, no one rushed to leave. They stayed, sat, sipped tea, as if being near each other was suddenly enough. That night, back in the greenhouse, I wrote something new. October 26. My words have wandered far from this house, but they always begin here in the moment I chose to speak. I was never the burden. I was the blueprint. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself a rare indulgence. I wrote my name at the top of the page, not as author, as origin, as truth, as the woman who made silence a monument, then turned it into a path. The first frost came quietly. One morning in November, I opened the greenhouse door and found the mint leaves dusted in white. The air had shifted, crisp, still. It reminded me of the years when I woke before sunrise to make breakfast, my hands already knowing which child needed toast and which needed silence. But now the house was quieter in a new way, not hollow, but harmonious. Every morning had a rhythm. Clara's footsteps, Simone's distant voice in a Zoom meeting, Peter whistling while he brewed coffee, and mine writing, planting, watching. We no longer danced around the past. We had invited it to dinner and given it a seat not at the head of the table but close enough to remind us where we'd been. One afternoon, Clara came home, breathless, eyes gleaming. "You were quoted in a podcast." I blinked. What?" "It's called Generational Echoes. They read your journal entry from September, the one about the door and the key." She handed me her phone, scrolling to the clip. A woman's voice read, "The past is not a prison. It's a room with a door. Sometimes you're holding the key and don't know it." Then silence. Then, that line changed how I see my mother. I sat in my chair stunned not by the exposure but by the intimacy. My words once dismissed now traveled on invisible wires finding people who needed them most. That night I returned to my notebook and wrote, November 5th. I used to scream inwardly to be heard. Now I whisper and the world leans in. Peter's architecture firm reached out to ask if I'd consult on a new project designing multi-generational homes, spaces that honored privacy and presence equally. We want your perspective, he said. You've lived it. I agreed, but on one condition. Design a room that doesn't need permission, I said. A place for people to go and just be. He called it the listening room. Clara later told me he was pitching it to developers as a standard feature. Standard. Imagine that. Silence not as exile but as sanctified space. Then came the hospital call. Not for me, for Marianne. My dear friend, the one who had read my book and shared that wedding chart wound, had collapsed in her garden. I visited her the next morning. She lay in a sun-drenched room with pale curtains and the scent of antiseptic humming in the air. She opened her eyes when she heard my steps. You're here, she whispered. Always. I brought your book, she said, pointing weakly to the nightstand. It was volume 2. The green one. I read it again this morning. The part where you say, I was not a burden. I was your beginning. I held her hand. You are someone's beginning too, Marianne. She smiled faintly. Then I'm not afraid anymore. She passed away 2 days later. At her memorial, Clara read the poem Marianne had written me. Simone arranged the flowers in the shape of open pages. Peter placed a blank notebook in the center of the reception table, inviting everyone to write one truth they'd never said. By the end of the day, the notebook was full. We called it the Quiet Book, and we decided to make it a tradition. Every year, one copy, one new book, one new set of truths. As winter pressed in, I found myself thinking more about legacy, not the kind written in wills, but the kind written in margins. The quiet things passed through tone and glance. The lessons folded between recipes and bedtime stories. Clara asked if she could record me. I want your voice, she said, not just your words. We recorded for hours, not just stories but philosophies, hopes, warnings. She asked, what would you tell someone who feels invisible? I paused, then said, you are not unseen. You are simply ahead of your time. She cried. And I held her like I once held Peter when he scraped his knee at 4 years old and thought the world would never stop hurting. One evening, Simone walked into the greenhouse holding a fresh journal. Soft blue cover, ivory pages. This one's for you, she said, not to keep the truth, but to dream again. I took it with both hands, surprised at the lump forming in my throat. Because dreaming is a muscle, and mine had atrophied. That night, I opened the journal and didn't write about the past. I wrote about what I still wanted. To grow lavender by the window, to teach Clara how to make soup without a recipe, to dance once more slowly barefoot in the kitchen, to die knowing that no part of me was lost in translation. The truth had carried me this far, but now perhaps it could carry me forward. Not just a ledger, a legacy, not just a burden lifted, a life reclaimed. December arrived wrapped in silver and silence. The first snowfall blanketed the greenhouse roof like frosting on an old birthday cake. I sat inside with a mug of cinnamon tea watching the flakes drift slowly to the earth, each one as unhurried as a memory returning home. The greenhouse had become more than a sanctuary. It was now a destination. People came from nearby towns to walk its narrow aisle, touch the leaves I'd planted, red quotes etched into the wooden planter boxes. Peter had installed a small brass plaque at the door. Speak softly. The truth listens here. Even strangers seemed to instinctively lower their voices when they entered. Simone had taken over curating the growing archive of letters and stories we received. She printed each one on delicate parchment paper and filed them by theme: mother's mistakes, memory, mercy. She called it the echo cabinet. Each visitor could sit open a drawer and read a voice from someone they'd never met, but somehow knew. Clara created an audio version. She called it Echoes in the Greenhouse. She recorded volunteers reading the letters aloud, including the awkward pauses and cracks in their voices. I want people to feel the courage, she told me. One afternoon, I returned from my walk and found a bouquet of yellow tulips on my writing desk. No card, but I knew. Marlene. A week later, her voice came through the phone for the first time in 21 years. She cleared her throat twice before speaking. I wasn't sure you'd answer. Neither was I said, smiling. We talked for hours, not about what had happened, but about what hadn't. All the things we never gave ourselves permission to feel, all the truths we buried under the phrase, "It's just how things were." She told me she'd started a truth circle in her retirement home. She called it Late Bloomers. Her voice trembled when she said, "I think I'm finally becoming the sister you deserved." "I think you always were," I replied. "We just forgot to look." That Christmas, our home was full. Not with presents, with people. Clara's friends, Simone's coworkers, a neighbor who had no one else. Each brought a written truth and placed it beneath the tree wrapped like a gift. We read them aloud after dinner, one by one. A man confessed he had never told his daughter he was proud of her because his own father never said it to him. A woman admitted she hadn't spoken to her mother in 10 years, not out of hate but habit. Another simply wrote, "I miss the version of myself who used to sing in the car." There were tears, laughter, silence, but no shame. Only release, only carrying. Later that night, Peter and I sat on the back porch wrapped in blankets, watching Clara chase snowflakes in the yard. "You changed this family," he said. "No," I replied. "I reminded this family." He looked at me quiet. "What do we do when you're not here anymore?" he asked. I sipped my tea. "You tell the truth." "That's it? That's everything." A week later, I had a dream. I was in a long hallway lined with doors. Each door had a label, words I never said, things I thought would break me, people I still love. I opened one. Inside, I found Clara, older now. She was reading my journal to a group of women seated in a circle. Their faces were wrinkled, weathered wise. They were listening, not just politely, deeply. She looked up at me and said, "We're still writing it, Grandma." And I woke with tears on my cheeks, not of sadness, of knowing. On New Year's Eve, Clara handed me a folded piece of paper as the fireworks burst gently outside our window. It read, "I used to think truth was heavy. Now I know it's the thing that makes us light enough to fly. Thank you for showing us how to carry it." Clara, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, because everything I had once begged the world to hear had been heard. Because silence, when broken by truth, doesn't shatter, it sings. And finally, at long last, I was part of the song. January thawed like a reluctant apology, slow, uneven, full of muddy puddles and bright, impossible sky. The greenhouse breathed through its glass panes. Condensation drew lines down the walls like fingerprints, as if the truth itself was pressing against the surface, wanting to be let out again. I had started teaching a small weekly writing circle inside just 5 women, all over 60. We called ourselves the Revisionists. Each brought a page from their life they wished they could rewrite. The rules were simple. Write what hurt. Write what healed. Read both out loud. One woman, Evelyn, wrote about the day her son moved away and never looked back. Another, May, shared a story of pretending not to hear her husband call her useless because silence seemed safer than confrontation. But the one that silenced the room came from Joanna, who said, "I stopped singing because someone once told me I was too loud." She sang for us that day. Just a verse. Just enough. And we cried not because it was perfect, but because it was finally heard. Later that night, I added a new line to my journal. January 18. When a woman writes her truth, she doesn't just remember herself, she resurrects. The publishing house Clara submitted to finally called back. They didn't just want her manuscript. They wanted the story behind it. She stared at the email, jaw slack, eyes wide. "They want to include your journal entries in the preface." I raised an eyebrow. "Do they know I spell because with a Z when I'm angry?" She laughed, wiping her eyes. "They want the real you, all of it." I agreed on one condition. We'd write the introduction together. So we did, across 3 late nights, 4 pots of tea, and 1 minor disagreement about comma usage. In the final paragraph, we wrote, "This book is not about blame. It's about ballast, the kind that keeps a ship upright even in dark waters." Our family nearly sank from silence. This is how we learned to speak, to stay, to stand. Elsbeth and Clara, The day the book went to print, Peter surprised me with something unexpected. A chair, not just any chair. My husband's old reading chair. The one Simone had once replaced with something ergonomic. Peter had found it in storage, reupholstered it, and placed it in the greenhouse beside the desk. He didn't say anything, just stood back and waited. I sat down slowly, the familiar creak greeting me like an old friend. "I should have listened sooner," he whispered. I reached for his hand. "But you're still here. And that's what matters." He nodded. "Clara says I'm getting better at being uncomfortable." I smiled. "That means you're growing." The book launched in early February. We didn't do a big event. Just a gathering in the greenhouse, 20 chairs, hot cider, and a banner Clara hand-painted that said, "Our words made room for us." People brought their mothers, their daughters, even their ghosts. They read aloud from the book, not for applause, but for clarity. Some cried, some laughed. One man said, "I never thought my wife would forgive me." But hearing this, maybe there's still time. Clara placed a hand on my shoulder mid-event. "This isn't just your story anymore," she whispered. "It's a language." And I knew then. The truth I once carried alone was now being spoken in accents I'd never heard, but still understood. At home that night, I stood in front of the mirror in my room, the same mirror that once reflected a woman growing smaller by the day. Now I stood tall, soft, unafraid. I traced the lines on my face like they were rivers on a map, each wrinkle a route, each furrow a fork in the road I'd survived. Then I whispered aloud to no one and everyone, "I forgive you." Not Peter, not Simone, not Clara. Me. For the years I believed I had to earn space, for the silence I swallowed, for the truths I delayed. That entry in my journal was short. February 9th. Today I became my own sanctuary, and I underlined it twice. The truth had carried me through winter, but forgiveness, that quiet seismic shift, was what would carry me into spring. Spring announced itself with birdsong, loud, chaotic, alive. Clara called it the messy joy. She said winter was tidy in its stillness, but spring came in yelling like a toddler, demanding to be held. I liked that. The greenhouse, once a place of healing, had become a place of momentum. Visitors didn't just come to reflect, now they came to create. Truth circles grew into weekly workshops. People didn't just write their pain, they drafted forgiveness, letters, renewal vows, obituaries, for versions of themselves they were ready to bury. Simone taught a class called The Apology You Never Received. Peter ran weekend build sessions, helping others create miniature listening rooms in their own homes. And me, I started a new book, not a memoir, not a journal, a novel, a story about a woman who no one noticed until the world fell apart, and she was the only one who remembered how to sew, to heal, to stay. I didn't name her Elsbeth, but Clara said she read like me. She was called The Archive. When I told Simone about it, she tilted her head thoughtfully. "So this time you're telling the truth through fiction?" "No," I said, smiling. "This time I'm hiding it in plain sight." The publisher printed the second edition of The Truth We Carry after the first sold out online. They invited Clara and me to speak on a podcast about intergenerational healing. I almost declined. Who wants to hear an old woman stammer on a microphone? But Clara insisted. People don't need polish, Grandma. They need presence. So I agreed. And that's how I found myself in a small studio wearing borrowed headphones, talking to a stranger named Aria, who introduced us as Elsbeth and Clara Corwin, grandmother and granddaughter, co-authors and co-keepers of legacy. It sounded too grand, but I let it be. During the interview, Aria asked me, "What do you think your family learned from all of this?" I paused, then said, "They learned that love isn't always kind. And kindness isn't always easy. But when truth becomes part of your language, not just your crisis, everything changes." Clara added, "And I learned to stop waiting for someone else to go first." Later that night, I received an email from a woman in New Zealand. "I read your book with my daughter on opposite ends of a phone call. We didn't say anything for the first 30 pages, but by page 31 we were crying. I told her something I hadn't said in 20 years, that I left, not because I stopped loving her, but because I didn't know how to stay. Thank you for being the voice that echoed across oceans." I printed the email and placed it in the echo cabinet. Clara added a sticky note, proof that truth doesn't need a passport. One quiet evening in late March, I sat alone in the greenhouse. Rain tapped gently on the roof above me. I had just watered the seedlings. The air smelled of wet soil and peppermint. I opened my red journal, the gratitude one, and flipped through the pages. I found the first entry. She said my voice sounds like paper turning. I smiled. Then I turned to a blank page and wrote, March 28th. This is the chapter where nothing explodes. No betrayals. No accusations. Just me alive, present, unedited. Still writing. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was peace. And peace, I've learned, is the quietest kind of revolution. That weekend, we hosted our first multi-city virtual truth circle. Clara managed the tech. Simone moderated. Peter greeted guests in the chat. I sat in the center of the greenhouse surrounded by 20 devices showing 20 different faces, each one older, wiser, weary, waiting. We began as always with silence. Then the first voice spoke. Then the next. And then me. I read an entry from the truth. They wrote the same one from that night I handed out the envelopes. You called me a burden. I was your beginning. And you tried to write my ending without my consent. There was a long, holy pause. Then an older woman in the top right screen whispered, Thank you. That used to be my sentence. I think I'm ready to edit it. That night, I wrote one final line before bed. My truth used to be something I clutched. Now it's something I extend. April arrived like breath after holding it too long. Gentle, warm, a quiet exhale. The garden bloomed without ceremony. Daffodils blinked open like soft yellow eyes. Lavender danced along the edge of the fence. Even the stubborn hydrangeas, always late to the season, seemed eager this year. I moved slower now, not from weakness, but intention. Every step I took felt like punctuation. I had spent so much of my life being a comma, making room for others, pausing where needed, smoothing the edges. Now I was learning how to be the sentence. Clara received her first royalty check in the mail. She didn't tell me at first, just slipped a small envelope under my teacup at breakfast. Inside was a note. This came today. But the real profit was watching you become unforgettable. Attached was a hand-drawn sketch of me at my writing desk, the greenhouse behind me. Her signature read, For the woman who rewrote us all. She'd used part of the money to order me a custom pen engraved in gold. I was never a burden. I was the beginning. I used it to sign the dedication in my novel. For the quiet ones, the watchers, the recorders, the ones who remember what was said and dare to write it down. E.C. Marlene visited in mid-April. We hadn't seen each other in person since before the silence began. She stepped out of the taxi, slowly holding a bouquet of baby's breath and her own tattered copy of The Truth We Carry. We didn't cry when we saw each other. We just embraced and exhaled. She brought me a photo I'd forgotten even existed. Us as teenagers, arms slung around each other, wide-eyed and sunburned, laughing at something we'd clearly thought would matter forever. I want to be your sister again, she said. You always were, I replied. That evening, we sat in the greenhouse together, reading old letters aloud under strings of golden light. At one point, Marlene paused and looked around. This feels like being inside a heart. I nodded. That was the goal. The final truth circle of the season was held on a Sunday morning. 30 chairs in the backyard. No fanfare. Just spring air coffee in mismatched mugs and people holding notebooks like passports. One by one, we shared. A father apologized to his grown daughter for being absent during her childhood. A woman thanked her past self for surviving a toxic marriage. A teenager read a letter to her future self ending with, Please don't forget how much we had to learn just to speak. And then it was my turn. I stood, knees shaky but spine steady. I started this journey because someone called me a burden. I paused, let the wind catch the memory. And now, I am carried not because I'm light, but because they finally understand the weight of what I held. Silence. Then applause. Not the clapping kind, the stillness kind. The kind where everyone feels their own bones vibrating. Afterward, Clara whispered to me, I think your words are going to outlive us all. I looked at her. No, my dear, I said. Ours will. That night, I sat in the greenhouse long after the last guest had gone. A candle flickered beside me, casting long shadows across the pages I had written. I turned to a fresh page in my red journal, the final one, and I wrote, April 29th. They once said I was a burden, so I made them carry my truth. Not as punishment, as inheritance. Then I closed the journal, not because the story was over, but because the story was theirs now, to tell, to remember, to carry forward. I was no longer writing to be heard. I was writing so they would never forget. And now finally they wouldn't. They said I was a burden. That sentence used to sting like fresh vinegar in an open cut, sharp, invasive, unforgettable. But now it feels hollow. Like a song I used to hum when I didn't know better. Like a name I've outgrown. Because what they saw as heaviness was history. What they called inconvenience was inheritance. I carried recipes no one wrote down. Stories no one bothered to record. Love that shaped itself into folded laundry and listening ears. Pain that hardened into patience. Silence that became scaffolding. They tried to make me small. I handed them a mirror. They looked and saw themselves distorted by entitlement and dulled by comfort. And so I gave them back their words. Not weaponized. Witnessed. I didn't scream. I didn't strike. I documented. And in doing so, I became undeniable. This greenhouse, this family, this legacy, they were never born from rage. They were grown from reckoning. And now, when Clara speaks of me, she doesn't call me the quiet one. She calls me the first stone. The foundation. The beginning. Peter no longer tiptoes around the truth. He teaches others how to build space for it. Simone no longer edits her affection. She offers it unpolished, unrehearsed. And me? I no longer apologize for taking up room. I am the room. So if you're reading this somewhere someday trying to remember where your voice went, I'll tell you. It didn't leave. It was waiting. Beneath your silence. Inside your spine. In the corner of the room where no one looked. Pick up the pen. Write it down. Say the thing. And if they call you a burden, smile. And let them carry what they tried to erase. Because your truth isn't heavy. It's holy.